Hello. Thanks for tuning in today. I am still here in Lagos, Nigeria, recording for Lost Lagosians. If you're just tuning in, welcome. My name is Brodda Mike. I'm the host of the show. Today, I wanted to talk about something that I'm kind of shy of talking about. It's something I feel kind of bad that I have to talk about, and that's regarding my COVID test experience. So I'm recording this in the first week of March 2022. I know a lot of you probably want to travel to Nigeria, but it's quite expensive to fly down here, one. And two, also the nuances of keeping track with the COVID-19 tests and what's required of you to do. And those just tend to keep shifting. So I just want to provide an update and also report on my COVID-19 test experience in Lagos. So to fly to Nigeria, the Nigerian government released the latest COVID guidelines on December 5, 2021. And it's very simple in the sense that there are two documents required for you to board on any flight from anywhere to Nigeria. The first document you need is your negative PCR test. So locally, wherever you're coming from, you have to go to the lab, the hospital, the clinic, and you have to do a COVID test, the PCR test, and make sure it's negative. So once you have the negative result, which has to be done within 48 hours before you board, then you have to go to a website, which I'll link to this show notes. It's the Nigerian International Travel Portal. And then you upload the negative results that you got. And then you provide your biographical data. Then you have to choose from a list of labs closest to your destination in Nigeria and schedule a COVID PCR test within 48 hours of arrival. So arrival dates plus 1 day. So once you go through that step, you have to make a payment on the Nigerian portal, and then they'll give you a certificate to travel. It will have a QR code on it, and that's the second document you need. So you take your negative local COVID PCR test result along with this PDF or printout from the Nigerian International Travel Portal website. So take those two and then you board. When you get to the airport and boarding to Nigeria, they will check your temperature, make sure you don't have any fever symptoms. So it's pretty simple and straightforward in the sense that get a negative COVID test in your home country, wherever you're outbound, and then you upload that information to the Nigerian International Travel Portal and make a payment, pick where you'll be testing again upon arrival in Nigeria. So once you do that, then you show up for the COVID follow-up test on arrival wherever you chose before you left your country. So whenever you get to Nigeria, usually you get a call if you don't show up, and they will tell you, hey, we haven't seen you, or make sure you arrive on time. So I show up at the lab, and when I go out to the lab, sadly, the guy took the QR code that I'd gotten and scanned it, and he's like, oh yeah, you're assigned to this particular lab, so you're in the right place. And then he told me to go. He's like, okay, we're done here. And in my mind, I was thinking that I paid 50,400 naira. So which, if you convert that by the CBN rate, CBN stands for the Central Bank of Nigeria. Going by the Central Bank of Nigeria rate, so the first week of March 2022 of 416 naira, that's $121. So I just paid $121 to do a test, and the test is not being done. It just seemed like a bit of a sham because it's just this tent and a canopy outside somewhere with a sign saying COVID test. Again, nothing against having a lab in a tent. I understand that COVID is new to the world and the country was not necessarily prepared for COVID. Obviously, as time progresses, we'll have better structures to deal with COVID. But for the amount that I pay, I expected at least a seat. For the amount that I paid, I expected at least maybe a drink of cold water because it was sunny. And I get how these things work. People just, know someone who knows someone who knows someone, and COVID is on. Let's take advantage of it. So I walk in there and like, hey, I'm here for the test. The guy rightly scanned me and checked me in, and he told me to leave. And I'm going, where's the COVID test that I paid for? What happened? Can I do the COVID test? And he proceeded to read his qualifications to me. He's a registered nurse. He's licensed by the Lagos State Board of Nursing, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, sir, I paid $121 to do a test. which in developing countries of the world, this is a free test. Most people don't pay for it. Now I hear some people will say, well, your insurance pays for it. Yeah, I get that. But given how expensive it is to travel to Africa and why it can be kind of daunting for a lot of people, the last thing you want is to be paying for a service that you can't really get. But at least have the samples handy, but at least have the specimen, have the test kit. At the minimum, just try and pretend that you take my nose swabs versus just telling me to just go, that we're done, that I'm good. So I actually was protesting it, and I said, well, can I see the manager? But my friend with me was trying to calm me down. And then the nurse who's administering the test went off on me and said, you people think you are from America, you know everything. You want to tell us how to do our job. And really, no job was being done. So this is just my experience. It's what I experienced, and it's personal to me. That is not to say all COVID-19 arrival test centers are this way. That is not to say you're going to get the same treatment, but it's just what I experienced, and I suspect maybe a few other places will have similar experiences. This really, really happened to me, and it's kind of a personal experience. So I've heard a lot about this. I know of people that have told me about this. I've also heard about people saying, well, they just, forged the COVID test. And some countries in Europe at one point were banning or were saying Nigerian COVID tests are not valid. So if I paid $121 to do a COVID test upon arrival, I show up in Nigeria to do the test, and there's no specimen, no test, nothing. And the guy just tells me to just, that I'm good. So that makes me a little bit stunned because this happened in Lagos. I will not disclose the name of the lab just out of privacy, but it's expensive to travel to Africa to begin with, and once you travel to Africa, you have to deal with situations like this where you pay for a COVID test, but you can't really get the test because the lab just took the money. I mean, no resources, nothing. A lot of countries in Africa have tried to mitigate the cost of traveling because of COVID. So there are several ways they've tried to drive down COVID-19 testing costs in the region. Some have tried to reduce the number of tests required. That's a way to do it. So instead of me, since I tested 2 days ago in the USA, why do I need to come to Nigeria and test again? Again, I'm not a medical expert, but other countries have done that. For example, arriving passengers to Mali, Niger, Cote d'Ivoire only require negative COVID test from the country of departure. Other countries have made efforts to mitigate additional travel costs for passengers by pricing their COVID-19 tests on a lower end of the fee spectrum. For example, Liberia charges just $50 for the COVID test if you are traveling to an ECOWAS country, as opposed to $80 charged for a travel test for those going outside of West Africa. So Ghana is another country that charges $50 for test upon arrival into Ghana, as opposed to $150 for people that are not ECOWAS passport holders. So if you're an ECOWAS country and you're traveling within ECOWAS, you pay $50. But if you're not holding an ECOWAS passport, you pay $150. Cape Verde also allows flight travel for individuals who can provide the government-issued COVID-19 facility. So if you've been vaccinated, Cape Verde they don't need the test because you've been vaccinated. So in 2021, there was a policy put out by the World Health Organization that advised many countries to remove mandatory testing and quarantine for travelers who were vaccinated. I'll link to that as well if you want to read that, if you want to read and look into that. So to me, it's just like a business way. It's a way of making money. So particularly with this situation whereby I paid $121, I show up at the test lab and there was no test kit, there was nothing. They just sent me away. So I did get a call from the government about 2-3 days later to verify if I had done the test, which makes me wonder if there's just a disconnect. If I already paid $121 to do a test, shouldn't the lab have notified the government that I've done the test technically? And then I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think there's a disconnect between what the government is doing and what the labs are doing. The government might be doing right, but then the people running the labs are also trying to make money. Uh, UNICEF announced a cheaper rapid test for as low as $2.55 per test. There's been a lot of reports that have shown that testing can be conducted on a day of travel, thereby eliminating the need for a second test on arrival. So if you kind of think about it, you begin to wonder, like, we're talking about corruption and tackling corruption, but here you are in March of 2022. In my case, I test on a day of travel because I flew at night. So in the morning of, I tested. So I tested before leaving the USA, and then I got to Lagos 48 to 72 hours later, and then I tested again. And then I paid $121, but I didn't quite get the test done because I was just told to leave, that I'm good to go. And then 3 days later, the government called me and said, they want to make sure I've been tested or I've done the COVID test. To make things more worse, or to complicate matters further, the registered nurse who was allegedly administering my arrival COVID test told me to let him know when I'm leaving, that for an additional 20,000 naira, he can get me a departure COVID test result. So in other words, if I were to leave, if I planned on leaving, if I'm leaving Nigeria in Lagos back to US, that for 20,000 naira, he would give me a second follow-up test. I actually told him I didn't know when I was leaving or where I'll be leaving from, because I might be in other parts of Nigeria as well. I planned to anyway. And he proceeded to tell me that it didn't matter wherever I was. So if I was in Abuja, I'm flying out of Abuja. From Abuja, I'll get a COVID-19 departure test. And it will show me as passed, or that I passed the test, even without stepping into the lab. So in the earlier days, I was in Nigeria last year as well, during the COVID era. In the earlier days, they didn't have like these systems where you can check and scan. People were literally just typing up COVID results on the computer. But now there's a way of verifying and tying into the system, because the government have tried to tighten that. But for this lab to tell me when I'm leaving, they will give me another negative test. It makes me wonder that people within the system are actually corrupt, and people within the system, they're actually making Nigerians look bad. So I'm still kind of, what do I do? So I'm still kind of thinking about what do I do and how do I handle this. Clearly, I'm going to be testing in another lab before leaving. The US requires a 2-day test before coming back into the US. So I'm not going to be using the lab that I used, and I wouldn't be using the same lab. I would get another lab completely independent from the lab I used earlier. And I wouldn't be giving him the 20,000 naira that he requested. It's just really sad to see that things have come to this. And this is in a situation, in a nation where we are talking about corruption and how do we fight corruption. And you have people still doing this in March of 2022. So a few things to keep in mind. Number one is that the COVID test, is it really necessary to test 4 times? Again, I'm not a medical expert, I'm not a doctor, but some countries have eliminated the arrival test. Is that something we should do in Nigeria? Is it just a way of making money from people? Then secondly, can we do something to reduce the price? It's just a test. Why should I have to pay $121 for a COVID test? Why should every Nigerian flying into Nigeria pay $121 for a COVID test, which I'm sure a lot of them will not get done, just as was in my case. And that's why I said I feel kind of bad with this episode. But it's something that really hurts a little bit because I've challenged my European friends saying, well, in Nigeria and Europe, they banned Nigerian COVID tests, and this is really, really happening to me in March of 2022. Just something to think about, because the other thing is, why do they charge as much as they do? Why not keep it cheaper to encourage people to come to Nigeria? With the current Ukraine-Russia situation and the price of oil and gas and petrol going high, being expensive, it makes flight tickets quite expensive as well. So if you are shelling $2,000, $3,000, $1,500, depending on which country you are coming from, to visit your home country, why should your country be also stifling you? So yeah, that's all I have for this show. I just wanted to drop this, and it's something to think about. If you would like to give me a feedback or advice, go ahead and do that on Twitter at Lost Lagosians, Instagram at Lost Lagosians, and Facebook page at Lost Lagosians. We're also on YouTube at Lost Lagosians. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one. Ekoni Baje.